Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. I'm here to tell you that, in spite of everything, you've made it. You've made it to Friday. My name is Kevin Impellizzeri. My pronouns are he, him, his. You can also go by doctor. And welcome to This Isn't Pac-Man Anymore, the 1993 moral panic over video games, which is my 8-part series answering the question of how did video games get age ratings in the United States? It's a question that has taken us through some interesting avenues of discussion. So here's an overview of what we've covered so far, both for the benefit of longtime viewers and if you're new to the series. In the first episode, we examined the question of what is a moral panic, then segueing into what video game anxieties looked like before this panic over video games in 1993. Then for parts 3 and 4, we went into some technology and entertainment and media fads that influenced both video games and the panic over them, those being the virtual reality craze and full motion video or FMV games. Last week, we examined a larger moral panic going on that influenced the panic over video games, which was the crime panic, and how concerns over violent crime led to concerns over violent media, and then led to concerns over violent video games. Today, we're going to examine two specific targets that were notable targets of moral anxiety during this period that led to a set of congressional hearings. Those are Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. In fact, for a minute, we should back up for a second, because last we met, back in part 5, which you can view by checking out the link in the description below to the full description, to fill the full playlist of our series. When we last left it, we were talking about anxieties over video games and how they came out of this crime panic, which led us to, we're going to do that in a second, which led us to Senator Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut. And on December the 1st, 1993, Joseph Lieberman held a press conference calling out the video game industry for violent and explicit content and called for regulation, either by the industry or by the federal government. He was accompanied by members of the National Parent-Teacher Association, as well as Bob Keeshan, who for a long time had been a children's television host of the show Captain Kangaroo. And they announced, Lieberman announced a series of congressional hearings on the issue of violent video games, with the first scheduled a week after that on December the 9th, 1993. Among his notable targets were two games in particular, the ones that, again, are going to be the topic of today, Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. So we're going to get ourselves acquainted with these two games. One of them probably needs less of an introduction than the other, but we're going to examine them, examine what the concerns were, and how this leads into congressional hearings and the thought of regulating video games by the federal government in some way, shape, or form. So that's what the episode's going to talk about. So here's an overview where we're going to go. We are going to examine some of the key targets of moral entrepreneurs during the 1993 moral panic over video games, specifically Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. And we're going to place Mortal Kombat and Night Trap within their proper context in 1993 America, both as pieces of media and as video games. What kinds of technology they represented, what types of influences they had on the video game industry, if at all. And with that, address their impact as well as their quality. Were these good games at all? And then we'll examine what was the larger public saying about these games and games like them. So that's where we're going to go today. I think it's going to be an interesting talk. We're going to delve deep into the 1990s, maybe hear about some games you've never heard of before, and talk about these two games, with Night Trap in particular, in their context, because it's easy to think about them in hindsight and how they influenced the creation of the ESRB. Let's talk about them, what it was like when they were games in this time period. So let's start with the first one. Mortal Kombat probably needs no introduction, but for the uninitiated, Mortal Kombat is a 2D, one-on-one martial arts fighting game. Combatants, spelled with a K, compete, also spelled with a K, in the best of 2 out of 3 matches, which the winner of 2 out of 3 wins, obviously, the match. But they also get to finish the opponent with one of a number of violent fatalities. Midway's developed this game. It was the lead producers for Ed Boon and John Tobias, and they developed it as a bloody answer to Street Fighter II. In addition to the fatality moves, blood sprays generously from big hits from opponents in Mortal Kombat. And I think everybody knows the twist on this is that opponents can be executed if a person enters a specific button combination at the end of the match. The other big twist, besides the violent content of Mortal Kombat, was its use of digitized sprites. Live actors posed for all the scenes within Mortal Kombat, and then they were digitized and created representations within the game. So it was a pretty high degree of realism for a fighting game, especially compared to the cartoonish animations of Street Fighter II, which it was competing with. Beer comes off the screen. And Mortal Kombat was a big breakout hit in 1992. It was the big arcade hit, thanks in no small part to its digital realism and gore. Now, Mortal Kombat was not, in terms of the use of digitized sprites, was not new. There were several games that tried it before. For example, in 1983, the arcade version of Journey, not the one you're thinking of, but one with the actual band Journey, which had digitized sprites of their faces on the characters in that game. Pit Fighter in 1990 was a fighting game that used a similar kind of technology, although not necessarily with the over-the-top violence that Mortal Kombat had, although it was still a fighting game. Now, Mortal Kombat obviously was also not the first violent video game either, although at the time it got a lot of attention for how well it was doing and the shocking degree of violence it had. But we've covered a couple of violent video games in the past. So I'll start with a selection of a couple of them here. The first we'll talk about, we mentioned a few episodes back, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre by Wizard Games from 1982. And Wizard marketed this in the holiday season of 1982 as the first violent video game, with you allowing you to play as the violent Leatherface, or in a less fun alternative, playing one of his victims. This, again, for those who don't recall, this advertisement from 1982 for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which said, "Put aside your childish pastimes, stop eating dots and chasing ghosts. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a violent video game that lets you play out the part of the vengeful Leatherface or an innocent victim looking for safety. Know the pleasures of total destruction as you put yourself in the classic horror movie, the first violent video game, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre." There were other games that had violent content in them and depicted blood and violence and all of that, such as the 1986 Exidy light gun shooter game Chiller, which involved in several levels. You, for example, shooting people in a torture chamber and causing all sorts of violence and gore for points. There was Narc, the 1988 Williams arcade game. This is the Reagan war on drugs in one game, where you were literally going in with weapons and shooting up drug dealers in the inner city and blowing them up, as you can see here. And then another one we mentioned a while back, which is Techno Cop, developed by Razorsoft in 1990 for the Sega Genesis, which had its advertisements and the packaging bore an advisory saying that scenes depicted can be of violent nature and not intended for those under 12 years of age. And then there was also the Splatterhouse series, with the first arcade version of Splatterhouse developed by Namco, came out in 1989. There were 3 games initially in the series. There's since been a remake that came out in 2010. But between 1989 and 1993, there were several games. This one, the left you see here, was the TurboGrafx 16 version of Splatterhouse, the first home version of Splatterhouse, which bore a warning that said, "The horrifying theme of this game may be inappropriate for young children and cowards." And the one on the right, the one that appeared in the Sega Genesis, Splatterhouse 2, which had a warning that said the game contains excess scenes depicting graphic violence, which may not be suitable for younger players. All these games depicting some level of blood and gore. And if you're familiar with the Splatterhouse series, those games have that in spades. So while Mortal Kombat was not necessarily new in what it was doing, it became a breakaway hit. It became very popular in the arcades in 1992. Acclaim acquired the home rights to develop Mortal Kombat for home systems, specifically for to publish it for the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the Game Gear, and the Game Boy. And we'll talk a bit about the home versions in a moment. But Mortal Kombat's success inspired tons of other similar fighting type games that either depicted digitized sprites of live actors or included some level of over-the-top violence, blood spilling out from attack moves, and those big finishing fatality moves, or both digitized actors and over-the-top violence. And we're going to go through a couple of them because a bunch came out during this time period. So here's a selection of them, starting out with two games by Strata, Time Killers and Bloodstorm. The one you see on the right here is Bloodstorm from 1994. The hook of this game was that you could, in addition to doing fatality moves, you could deal enough damage to an opponent's limbs where their limbs would fly off. And so, for example, they wouldn't be able to punch, or in Bloodstorm wouldn't be able to kick because they have no legs. And if you did enough damage to a character's head, you could do a fatality finishing move before the game even ended. Think of the brutality moves for Mortal Kombat X and kind of the same thing. Then there was Eternal Champions, which was developed by Sega, initially released for the Genesis in 1993, which the first Eternal Champions didn't have fatalities per se, in that the players could not engage them, but there were stage finishers like this one here, where a person is burned alive at the stake. However, the sequel, Eternal Champions Challenge from the Dark Side, which came out for the Sega CD in 1995, did have finishing moves and a lot of more over-the-top gore than its predecessor, obviously inspired by the success of Mortal Kombat. Then there was Primal Rage, one of my personal favorites. You play as one of several dinosaurs on a world that's shaped like a dinosaur head, like a little egg thing. You have to conquer different territories as these giant, violent dinosaur and gorilla gods, and had over-the-top violence and fatality moves. There was Killer Instinct, one of the ones that had the most staying power, considering that there was a new version of it that came out a few years ago. Killer Instinct had the over-the-top violence, blood. It also had a very robust combo system, which may have inspired some later Mortal Kombat games, actually. My personal favorite character was Spinal, this Jason the Argonauts-looking type skeleton warrior. And then there was Way of the Warrior. This one came out for the 3DO. The most notable, and this one did have both over-the-top finishing moves and digitized sprites. It's not a very good-looking game. But the big notable thing about this, it was developed by a very notable developer now, Naughty Dog, makers of such games now as Crash Bandicoot and The Last of Us. But back in those days, they were still kind of like your over-the-top kind of company. Made notable by for example, their game Rings of Power, which was an RPG that had come out in 1992. I can be wrong the date. In which you could see the Naughty Dog logo and have if you entered a code, there was a woman who was topless at the beginning of it. Very, very mature Naughty Dog software. And then a notable one, this one actually didn't come out officially, developed by Data East Pinball, is the infamous Tattoo Assassins. The biggest claim to fame this game, as it says on the screen there, had 2,196 fatalities. They ran the gamut. You could tell they were running out of ideas. Everything from turning people into animals, to lighting farts on fire to burn people to death, to nudalities where you literally just made the opponent naked. It had a very interesting development cycle. It ended up never getting released, although it was far enough along that there were versions of the arcade cabinet that were at special events throughout the 90s. And I've put in an article down in the description that has a really interesting oral history of the development of Tattoo Assassins. Its story is probably more fascinating than the game itself could ever be. And then the last one I'll talk briefly about is Street Fighter, the movie, the game. We have here the Mortal Kombat inspired adaptation of a movie based on the game that Mortal Kombat was made to compete with. This didn't have fatality moves or over-the-top violence the way, say, Way of the Warrior did, but it used digitized sprites representing actors who were in the Street Fighter movie, which is interesting film. I can't say it's a good film, but it's definitely an interesting film. So those are what the inspirations, and there were a bunch of other games that were inspired by the popularity of Mortal Kombat and its competitor Street Fighter, both in terms of fighting games and in terms of over-the-top violence and gore. But let's go back to Mortal Kombat because it was a huge hit in the arcades and ports were inevitable. As I mentioned briefly before, Acclaim acquired the home publishing rights to develop it on the Super NES, Genesis, Game Gear, and Game Boy. And they geared up people for the home release of Mortal Kombat with a $10 million advertising campaign culminating in Mortal Monday, September the 13th, 1993. You could not escape these ads. In addition to my gaming background, I'm an avid collector of comics, particularly 90s comics, and there are so many comic books that bear this prepare yourself advertisement for Mortal Monday. So, as I said, it came out for all of these major systems. However, not all versions of Mortal Kombat were created equal. So, for example, Nintendo, as I mentioned a few episodes back, had very strict internal content restrictions. For example, things that were restrictions on over-the-top violence. So, the version that came out for the Super Nintendo, developed by Sculptured Software, got rid of all the blood, replaced some of it with sweat, as you can see in this GIF here, and no longer called them fatalities. Still had finishing moves, but some of them were scaled back. It's kind of interesting to see the compromises they made. For example, you can still knock someone down into a pit of spikes like you could in the original Mortal Kombat. I'm just going to take this off for a moment. However, once they hit the ground, there's no blood. Raiden can still do his electrocution fatality, which will turn an opponent to dust. Scorpion can still take off his mask and burn a person alive and turn them into a burning skeleton. The same with Sonya's Kiss of Death, where the kiss will fly through the air and hit them and incinerate them. However, some of the other fatalities were scaled back. For example, Sub-Zero, infamously, would be able to grab an opponent and rip their head out with a spinal cord attached. Well, that did not get into the Super Nintendo version. Instead, he would freeze someone and punch them until they shattered. This kind of goes back to the, and also I'll point out that the Game Boy one was extremely sanitized. Is generally considered the worst version of these because it even went further than that. It even removed a character to accommodate for the Game Boy's low memory and storage space. This actually goes back to something I talked about a little while back in part 2 when I mentioned Carly Kukurik in her book Coin-Operated Americans discussed this idea of acceptable and unacceptable forms of violence. So we see that that despite the fact that the blood depictions and the fatalities are scaled back, the game still retains its initial identity as a fighting game. You still punch and still kick. You can punch people till they shatter if you freeze them, and so there's a certain element of that there too, which kind of shows how the Nintendo restrictions were not necessarily as cut and dried as even Nintendo made them out to be. In fact, to reinforce this is from the September 1993 review from EGM of the Super Nintendo version of Mortal Kombat, which viewed it unfavorably compared to other versions, saying, quote, "No matter how much you sanitize the game, it still involves killing people, some of them women. And I bet there isn't an 8-year-old in the country who doesn't know the real premise behind the game. So what have you accomplished, Nintendo? Not a lot, other than make everybody unhappy." So again, kind of acceptable versus unacceptable forms of violence, and how it's still a fighting game and still has that element, even if it doesn't have the blood. Now, I mentioned a while ago about blood contents. Well, while the Super Nintendo and Game Boy didn't have them, another version did, the Genesis one, and the Game Gear one, in fact. Now, the way they got around this is that they were hidden behind secret code. So if you booted up the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat, you would see this statement here, talking very cryptically about code. And I feel like if this game had come out after this message had come out after Mortal Kombat became popular, those codes definitely been spelled with a K because it's that edgy. The idea was that this screen, if you entered a special code, abacab, ABACABB, incidentally, also the name of a Genesis song and album by the band Genesis. The letters would turn from white to red, and all the blood content would be in there, including the fatality moves and even good old Sub-Zero's head-ripping extravaganza. The Game Gear one also had a code that would allow for fatalities and blood. And this should come as no surprise. The home version of the Genesis version of Mortal Kombat was both better received in terms of critical reception than its Super Nintendo counterpart. It also significantly outsold it. That may come back later on. And actually, overall, Mortal Kombat was an overwhelming success on the home market. It sold an estimated around 4 million units between all the versions by the end of 1993. That's a course of 3 months that it did that. So this is an extraordinarily big, successful game with a lot of exposure. And the reason I emphasize high exposure is because the next game we're gonna focus on didn't really have any of that, because we are finally talking about Night Trap. So this is one of those games like Dragon's Lair where I think Night Trap is better remembered than actually played. And not quite in the way that Dragon's Lair is well remembered for its impressive visuals. It still look great now, despite not being a great game. Night Trap is kind of the opposite. It's kind of reviled and considered infamous. But I would say the majority of people who know anything about Night Trap have probably never played it. Although I could be wrong now because Nintendo, the Nintendo and the PS4, the Sony PS4, the major systems all over the place today, that it's been on the PS4 and the Switch in the remastered edition. But let's put that aside for a minute and talk about Night Trap. So we mentioned a couple of episodes back about FMV games, and I mentioned Digital Pictures as a notable company. Digital Pictures had been founded from the ashes of a failed project called Project Nemo, which was a joint project between the toy manufacturer Hasbro and a company founded by Atari founder Nolan Bushnell named Axelon, with the idea that the Nemo was going to be a VHS-based system. Now, when the Nemo was in development, a few games came out of that. Initially, in 1986, Axelon developed a prototype called Scene of the Crime. It's kind of an Agatha Christie-style whodunit, which involved players switching between various rooms of I believe, of a hotel or a mansion. It wasn't really designed as a full-fledged game, more as a proof of concept, both of the visual qualities and the actual gameplay interaction. It interested Hasbro enough for them to greenlight the development of a full-fledged game, and that game ended up being Night Trap. Its project lead was a guy named Rob Fulop, under the supervision of Tom Zito. Now, Fulop had a pretty good industry pedigree. He was a former Atari programmer. He was responsible for the 2600 version of Missile Command, one of my personal favorite games, at least in that era. He also developed the Atari 400 and 800 versions of Space Invaders. In 1981, he was the co-founder of Imagic, which was one of several third-party companies formed by former Atari programmers following the departure of 4 notable developers who formed Activision. He worked on Demon Attack, which was one of Magic's big hits. So he's sort of the lead programmer for this. The director of Night Trap was a guy named James W. Riley, who since then has made his name for himself as a visual effects specialist with a lot of television experience, including working on 24, Californication, and House of Lies, well after Night Trap. And its script was written by a guy named Terry McDonald, who was a newspaper and magazine editor, who at the time was the editor-in-chief at Esquire. The filming of Night Trap took about 3 weeks. Rob Fulop at one point recalled that it took about 16 days to film. Its budget was anywhere between $1 and $1.5 million. I've seen differing accounts of the exact dollar figure. Which would mean it cost between about $2.3 and $3.4 million in modern money to make. Most of the work on the game was the development of the actual interface and the editing. Like I said, it was filmed specifically over the course of about 16 days. It was apparently an interesting production, particularly for the actors involved, because it had a huge script. There was only about an hour and a half of footage that was filmed for Night Trap as an FMV game. However, it had a 250-page script. Now, if you're curious for scale, an average Hollywood film script is usually between 95 and 125 pages. So it's filmed. However, after it had been filmed, interest in the Nemo by Hasbro faded away. High production costs were there, and they canceled the project. And so it was shelved until the early 1990s, particularly 1991, 1992, when some of the members of the Nemo team, such as Tom Zito, formed Digital Pictures and entered a deal. We have a cat behind us here. Entered a deal with Sega to develop a bunch of FMV games for the Sega CD, which came out in October of 1992. So why don't we talk a little bit about what Night Trap is? So Night Trap was the concept of Scene of the Crime, but more in a B-movie schlock kind of way. So in terms of a game, imagine Five Nights at Freddy's. It's kind of that before it was a thing on a sort of a broad level. So the story of the game is you play as an agent of a paramilitary group called SCAT. Initially, the Special Control Attack Team, and then when they adapted it for the Sega CD, the Sega Control Attack Team. And you are monitoring a slumber party through a hacked security system at this winery house. And you monitor security cameras as partygoers go into the slumber party, and these shambling black-clad creatures the game describes as augurs or augs are trying to capture the people involved. And this is just going to briefly show, this is the box for the Sega CD version of Night Trap, and on the right, the Sega CD, which of course was an add-on for the Sega Genesis. Let's go again for a little bit more about Night Trap and its gameplay. So again, you're part of this this sort of special forces paramilitary group called SCAT. At this house, a bunch of people have disappeared. You have reason to believe that there's some sort of nefarious doings going on. And you found out that this house has a elaborate security system and trap system in it. And you found a way to hack into it. The game plays out over the course of several surveillance cameras, 8 in all, who are situated in 8 different rooms. And as these black-clad figures, the augurs I mentioned a minute ago, as they make their way in the house to try to capture the partygoers, you trip traps at specific times to try to capture them. Here's how the game introduces its premise. It says, 5 teenage girls have disappeared after spending the night at the old Lakeshore winery house of Mr. and Mrs. Victor Martin and their children, Jeff and Sarah. Right now, another 5 girls are heading towards the Martins to spend the night. Your mission, protect those girls from whatever happened to the last ones. Now listen up. Last night, one of our agents got into the house and found some kind of weird security system. Hidden cameras in almost every room and a series of traps. Our agent spliced an override in the security system, allowing you to control the cameras and the traps with this remote unit he holds the controller of. Use the traps to capture anyone or anything that endangers the lives of those girls, but make sure you don't trap someone you should be protecting. One slight problem, the traps are protected with an access code. They won't work unless you enter the right code, and anyone inside the house can change the code at any time, so pay close attention to what they're saying. So again, game plays out through 8 surveillance cameras in 8 rooms of the house. Each camera will display one of 3 things: a static room with nothing happening in it, scenes with actors who are advancing the plot in some way, or the shambling augs making their way through the house. As they make their way through the room, you're going to see this meter in the bottom right corner, just below the visuals of the augurs, is a little meter. It's a green right there, but when it gets into red, you hit a button and it'll trip a trap and show a scene of them being caught. You can also trap members of the family and the partygoers too. And later on, you learn that the main villains are the Martin family themselves, because as it turns out, they're vampires. And the augurs are actually in their employ as these shambling, kind of like half vampires, kind of not quite vampires. The game says that they hunger for blood, but are somehow not vampires and want to be true vampires like the Martins are. And apparently they dress in black, not because they couldn't afford to have any decent production, but because supposedly they're so hungry for blood their skin is falling off. It'd be nice if they had any kind of visual of that. Oh yeah, and the traps are operated by codes, which change at certain intervals in the story. And if you try to use them, the code is wrong, then it's not going to work. And you have to actually listen to dialogue. Say, I'm changing the code to orange. I'm changing the code to green. And so if you trip a trap, someone gets sent to Misty Doom, as you can see here. And again, the goal is to try to not get the right people killed and try to protect people from these vampires. And like I said, as you go, the game plays out scenes that are happening in real time. So everything is happening simultaneously. So that's what Night Trap is in kind of a nutshell. So let's go to the question, is Night Trap a good game? And I put this on the screen already. No, it's not a good game. In terms of quality, it's just not a very good game. On the one hand, Night Trap suffers from a lot of the issues that other FMV games. And if you recall from my episode a few weeks ago on FMV games and what their limitations are, Night Trap has them in spades. It's got very limited interactivity to the extent of the gameplay. You're just hitting a button. You're moving between cameras, and when the game tells you to, you hit this one button, and you either trip the trap or you don't. And it plays out the exact same way. It's scripted. The game has no variety. It's got no variations in play. The plot plays out exactly the same way. And if you notice that the game even has a timer, so they said 14:56 on the screen, because the idea is that you will know when things are going to happen by monitoring the time. This thing happens at 10 minutes, this thing happens at 20 minutes, whatever. But as a result of that, this game is really unforgiving, too. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. It's really easy to get overwhelmed. There are just way too many augurs to trap. If you play through the entire game, there are 95 possible encounters. And the game is also very short. If you know what you're doing, if you know where all the augurs are and you trap everything, you get to the end of the game will be finished in 25 minutes and 52 seconds. So you can beat it in less than a half hour. However, like I said, there are 95 capture opportunities. That translates to roughly one capture every 3.75 seconds. As a result of that, you are constantly scanning between rooms, because the thing is, there are lots of fail conditions in this game. One of them is that if you get overwhelmed by augurs, and it's been a while since I played the Sega CD version, I believe if you miss about 30 capture opportunities, which is not hard to do, to miss them, it's pretty easy to miss them, then the game automatically fails you and you have to restart the whole thing over again. And in fact, you think that you can watch the scenes play out, for example, the opening of the game, and actually learn about who these characters are and why we should care about all this and why we should protect them from the augurs. And while you're watching that, within the first minute, there are at least 15 capture opportunities that you could be missing. So as a result, you need to memorize where things are. You need to do it out through trial and error. And this game is you're either going to be constantly switching between rooms and hoping that you catch something, or playing it long enough that you know where these things are, and only catching brief snippets of story, or not getting any story at all because you're going through them. Or the reverse is going to happen. You're going to try to pay attention to this schlocky B-movie story that it has and be completely overwhelmed by augurs. I mentioned a few minutes ago there are lots of ways to fail. One of them is if you get overwhelmed, but there are also specific scenes where you have to rescue partygoers from the augurs before they capture them. And if you miss them, automatic game over on the Sega CD version. In the later versions, the one that's out for the Switch now, for example, has a save and load feature where you can load checkpoints. But the OG Night Trap, if you missed one of them, you would just start all the way over again. And by the end of the game, when the plot's really picking up and you realize the Martins are vampires and they're trying to capture everybody, you have to catch them too, then you could very easily get yourself in situations where you're very close to the end of the game and you miss one, or you accidentally trap a party goer when you weren't supposed to, and you have to start the whole game over again. It's infuriating. It's such a frustrating game. I am astonished that anyone wasted their time on it, to be very, very frank. And I mean, it's hard to see things. It was graphically impressive for the time, but the footage here is really grainy. It's hard to make out fine details. It's kind of an arduous game, and it's not pretty fun. And my super hot take on Night Trap is that were it not for the controversy, this game would have faded into obscurity next to all those other digital pictures games like Double Switch and the Make My Video series and Sewer Shark, and would have just been a curious footnote in gaming history, kind of piled up with the rest of those FMV games of the early 1990s. And it's also like it's kind of an over the top game that was kind of made to be silly, but it's so let's talk actually for a minute about the critical reception to it. This is Dana Plato, by the way. She was the most noteworthy, probably the most famous actor of the time. She had just come off a run on Different Strokes, and went to do this FMV game sometime after that. It's going to get that away because the GIF is going to be a little distracting. But you might be curious of what people thought about this game when it came out. And it kind of had a mixed critical reception. Reviews were pretty mixed, with most of the positive reviews for Night Trap focused on the visual style and the realization offered by digitized live actors. There are several reviews that were impressed by the fact that you have real people that they're interacting with, and that creates a certain interesting level of immersion that a pixelated game wouldn't. And that was one of the general appeals of FMV games, their quality notwithstanding. However, most critics also observed that Night Trap lacked gameplay variety. They pointed out its lackluster plot. For example, there were a panel of critics for EGM that overall gave the game a 6 out of 10. That was an average from 4 reviews. Two gave it a 5 out of 10. One gave it a 6 out of 10. One gave it an 8 out of 10. With one critic saying, the digitized pictures are decent, but the plot needs some work. With another saying, if there were ever a game targeted at a preteen male audience, this is the one. So it was kind of a game for a very specific kind of niche. It was definitely, you have girls at a slumber party who are kind of skimpily dressed. They're wearing, their short shorts and all this stuff. Oh my God, provocative. And like a nightgown or occasionally somewhere. We'll talk about that in a second. That being said, another review, Dennis Lynch of the Chicago Tribune in January of 1993 called Night Trap, quote, the most original game of 1992. Again, going back to the visual style, saying, the game is not a total success. It lacks something in replayability, but it's worth a look if you want to see the cutting edge of new game technology. And John and Chip Carter of the Washington Post offered a similar criticism, saying in their review, quote, there's not a whole lot of variety in the game. To snag one of the briquette bad guys, you simply match the color of a particular room's video camera with that of your trap, and gamers looking for action will be bored before the opening credits finish rolling. Still, the film footage included in the game is impressive and indicative of what this new CD-ROM system should be able to do once game programmers get down to the business of creating plausible games. And so kind of backhanded criticism on the part of the Washington Post. Then there's the public reception. To say that the public reception, where people actually knew about this game, and that was not necessarily a guarantee thing, was fairly negative. Quick backlash, particularly among members of the press, and well as some retailers too. And so we'll get to the press reception in a second. But some of it hinged around a particularly infamous scene I want to focus on, which we'll see if my laptop will handle this. I give full credit for the video to Warped Pixels, and you can check out their channel for this video there too. So when people talk about Night Trap, they often talk about one scene in particular. Let's contextualize this in the event that my video doesn't work properly. So at about the 12 minute 32-second mark, there's a scene that happens in a bathroom where this character, Lisa, starts out by looking into a mirror, and then several of the augurs, again, they're supposed to be like wannabe vampires, sneak up behind her, and they've got this thing with this hook that's supposed to suck her blood out. And the idea is you're supposed to hit the trigger at the right time and trap one of them. If you successfully do it, one of them gets pulled down into the shower trap and falls into a pit. And then she manages to fight them off and then goes out a window and escapes. However, if you fail to do that, this is what happens. Let's see if it'll play. All right, it doesn't seem to be working, so I'll give a brief description of what happens. You can kind of see it here. She starts to panic and scream, and 3 of them come out. 2 of them grab her, and one of them puts this like big like vacuum cleaner type thing on her throat, and you briefly see a close-up of it kind of pushing back and forth like a little drill, and you see a little bit of red coming out, and then she's dragged off screen. It's a relatively short scene, a relatively not easy scene to get to, because like I said, it is really easy to get overrun at this point. So you've got to be on your game. This is about halfway through the game you can get to this point. And like I said, if you are not paying attention and they do this, you automatically lose. That's why you see the scat team override, because it's basically saying the game is over after this. After that, the head of scat berates you and says you should have saved her, you should have done something, and then he turns it off and you got to start the whole damn game over again. By this point, you had about 50 possible capture opportunities. So I better hope that you're on your game with all this stuff. That being said, like I said, this is a failure state. This is something you don't want to happen. Now, I will say it is, if you're not used to seeing live actors in kind of situations like that, it can be upsetting, particularly hearing someone scream like that, especially say if you're a younger player and you're used to more pixelated games. It can be surprising and upsetting. And I went back a couple of weeks ago when I talked about FMV games, how for me, as someone who was when this game came out, I was 8 years old. It would be upsetting to see someone screaming and in pain. So in that case, it does kind of have an effect on you. But we're going to talk about the scene more than a few times, because this is the scene that often people referred to in the press. I would be very curious of how they got there. Because that's all to say that the press reception, public reception was interesting. There were concerns about the realism of the actors, that is this unsettling nature, and some even went far as to say that this was violent and graphic, with some retailers getting a little squeamish and actually pulling it from the shelves, particularly when Night Trap came out and the Sega CD came out in Europe in May of 1993. Toys R Us pulled it from shelves in the UK and Australia. And it's possible that this response by Toys R Us then inspired Sega to think about a rating system. What's interesting about this game in Great Britain, it often was depicted in the American press that it was banned in the UK, it was banned in Australia. It was pulled from it's not accurate. It was pulled from the shelves by one specific retailer. In fact, in Britain, the game received a 15 rating, saying not suitable for audiences under the age of 15. In fact, according to the Times of London, this made it the first video game in Great Britain to receive an age rating from the British Board of Film Classification. So a group that usually examined films was now examining video games. And so it's possibly because of this concern in other regions that Sega decided to set up a rating system, because most of these Sega CD games and these FMV games were usually directed at an older audience than traditional games have been considered. And so they decided to kind of get ahead of the game. They created something called the VRC, or the Video Game Rating Council, which was created in late May of 1993. And the idea was that they would give an age rating, I mentioned this a few weeks ago, to games based on one of 3 classifications: GA for general audiences, MA13 for someone like a PG-13, not suitable for age under 13, and MA17 for adults. There is actually some division over whether or not, and Night Trap was probably an impetus behind this. There's some debate over what Night Trap got in terms of ratings, with some newspaper reports saying that it got an MA13 rating, and some saying it got an MA17 rating under the VRC. However, I have never seen any evidence of any packaging for Night Trap bearing the VRC rating. If you know of any, please let me know. Send me a message in the comments, or send me a message. I'll have my contact information at the end of this. But as far as I can tell, there was no packaging that had it. There were certainly ESRB ones later, but never for this. There was also some reports, for example, September 10th, 1993, LA Times article said that the game drew protests from various women's organizations. I haven't found any evidence of that, but it does suggest some anxieties over this particular game. And the game actually triggered a bunch of... It became kind of a topic of shock discussions among the press, with accounts of the games kind of embellishing what was actually happening in Night Trap. Night Trap is relatively bloodless. I mean, there are scenes of, for example, if you see people being grabbed by those big hook things, you might see a little bit of red going through tubes, but not the way that some of these places described it. For example, the June 2nd, 1993 article in the Los Angeles Times described Night Trap as a Sega game that depicts bloody attacks on young women. Another from a June 9th, 1993 article in the Chicago Tribune, which said in one scene a woman is graphically and slowly strangled. In another, woman is hung upside down like a steer carcass while her blood drips into a bottle. And from December 27th, 1993 article in the Philadelphia Inquirer saying, a game featuring the thrill of sexual violence, showing half-naked sorority sisters being assaulted. And many of these accounts of either women being hung up on meat hooks, akin to the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and having their blood drained and decanted into wine bottles. And so the meat hook thing is interesting just because it doesn't appear in the game, aside from there's one blink and you miss it scene where a person opens up a freezer and a person is hung upside down, and to the right of them are a bunch of bottles, which if you're looking at the Sega CD version, it's so grainy as to not really be clear what's happening. And if you're playing the game like you're supposed to, you're not going to be spending much time seeing it anyway, so I'm really curious how they got to this. I was only able to identify that they were wine bottles when I saw the remastered version for the Switch. But all these accounts saying people being hung on meat hooks, and naked women being hung on meat hooks, and these scantily clad women, and their blood being drained into these wine bottles, and kind of like these accounts kind of made it into like a game of telephone where it became more scandalous and more bloody and more violent with every retelling. But I would be really curious how many of them actually played it. Reportedly, Night Trap sold by the end of 1993 about 100,000 units, which is about, I think there were about 200,000 units total of Sega CDs that were sold. So maybe half of them had it over the course of the entire lifespan of the system. And the system had a limited audience. It was expensive. And so probably not a lot of people are getting to Night Trap, let alone playing it, let alone spending the time to memorize enough to get to, say, that infamous scene of the 12:30 mark. Like, there's a lot of factors that would lead into getting to that point. And it's very possible that, like, they could have just let this thing go away and it would have gone away on its own. I mean, this is at the same time Splatterhouse is out and other games like that. That certainly would have had maybe more sales and more exposure. So we have talks of meat hooks and wine bottles and things. And so Night Trap becomes kind of a common talking point when the issue of video game violence comes up, which kind of came out in terms of news coverage in kind of three waves. The first was when Sega introduced the VRC in May and June of 1993. The second was leading up to and right after Mortal Monday on September the 13th, 1993, when news coverage again is about violent video games with Mortal Kombat coming, and some people are bringing Night Trap into the conversation. And then the third time is in December of 1993 when you see the first congressional hearing about video games and video game violence on December the 9th. Again, preceded by the December 1st press announcement by Senator Joseph Lieberman. So we're going to go, so we've talked a bit about Night Trap, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about it a little later on. But so those are kind of the two big ones that come up in conversation in terms of video game violence. And this is that scene, that blink and you miss it scene, where you can kind of barely make out someone wrapped in like plastic. It is, unlike the accounts, is not supposed to be one of the party goers. This is apparently a scat agent who was caught by the vampires and the augurs and hung up in his drain. And you can kind of barely make it out. The rack that's next to him is supposed to be the blood decanting in the wine bottles, which became, again, this whole thing became a common topic of discussion. I'm also going to be super pedantic, and a lot of them talk about the house being a sorority house. It's actually not. It's this people's personal house is a winery. And there's stuff to be said about the male gaze and how it's like basically just a bunch of like, it's about a bunch of like conventionally attractive, like college age actors. It's very much trying to cater to that horny, like heterosexual boy. And it's all about gays and it's all about that, but it's also this kind of punishing difficulty with it. So it's kind of a lot of work for that titillation. But yeah, so that's Night Trap and Mortal Kombat. I'm going to go back to them in a second. But let's talk about some dishonorable mentions because they get a lot of the limelight, especially now in hindsight. But there were a couple of other games that came up during 1993, during the panic over violence, during the concerns over video games, during, again, these spats of anxieties, such as the creation of the VRC and the home release of Mortal Kombat. And this is some of the games that kind of came up. One that came up, interestingly, was a game that had come out several years before that. The first in the Leisure Suit Larry series, Leisure Suit Larry in the Land of the Lounge Lizards, developed by Sierra for the PC in 1987, which was, again, kind of an adult-oriented game where you follow this sort of lovable loser who's trying to, I guess, look for love in all of the wrong places. And so, in terms of depictions of sexuality in games, became kind of a concern. And then there's Lethal Enforcers. If you recall when I talked about FMV games a little while ago, shooting games were not uncommon, where they would show live actors as either unarmed civilians or terrorists or bank robbers or whatever. And Lethal Enforcers was an example of that. The arcade game was developed by Konami, with a home version eventually made for the Sega CD. Both the home version and the arcade version utilized a light gun called the Justifier. Remember that name. We're going to talk about the Justifier next episode. And then there was Splatterhouse. I mentioned the Splatterhouse series. Splatterhouse 3 in particular came up from a couple people. For example, editor of GamePro, Leanne McDermott, pointed out to the Los Angeles Times that there were worse games than Mortal Kombat and Night Trap, and cited Splatterhouse 3 in particular. And in fact, the over-the-top violence was a marketing point for Splatterhouse 3, with, for example, this ad poster that came out says, Splatterhouse 3 for the Sega Genesis is the kind of game rating systems were invented for. That will come up again, trust me. So these are just some other mentions. So you might want to wonder then, I've kind of gone through broad strokes like depictions of violence, concerns over things like sexuality. You might be want to concern what were the larger anxieties of Mortal Kombat. And the first one I'll mention is you cannot disassociate the concerns about Mortal Kombat in the press with retailers and eventually lawmakers with the crime panic. The stuff we went into a large amount of detail last week, this sort of huge explosion of media coverage of violence and violent crime in 1993 and into 1994. You cannot detach that from this. And so this comes from the idea that the larger extensions of the crime panic focused on concerns over violence in the media, which then led to concern over violence in video games. And the concerns over violence in video games were very similar to what we talked about last week with sort of the concerns about violence in the media. With the kind of sort of like two large camps, one being desensitization, and the other being recreation. So that on the one hand, that video games would desensitize people to violence, and on the other hand, that it might actually lead to people reenacting violent crimes in real life. So, for example, I mentioned a growing number of social scientists drew a causal relationship between the madness in the streets and glamorized violence in TV programs and movies, and even the next generation of entertainment video games. From a December 26, 1993 article in the LA Times. The one below that is an article by Carol Rivers from a June 1993 issue of the Chicago Tribune, which had the headline of "A Video Game Today, Crime Tomorrow," suggesting in particular that Night Trap was cultivating young men who may later commit sexual assaults and even maybe become serial killers. And that games, again, Mortal Kombat and the rest of the fighting games are just one more brick in the wall of violent images children encounter every day. The sort of constant exposure to violence in the media, with some suggesting, for example, this one, the California State Attorney General, Dan Lundgren, in November of 1993, issued a strongly worded letter to 12 video game companies based in Silicon Valley and California, expressing concern over depictions of violence and citing Mortal Kombat and Night Trap specifically. And among his statements, he said the continual exposure to violent images and themes in various entertainment may not be the direct cause of these atrocious acts, but violent video games do have a deadening, desensitizing impact on young, impressionable minds. So again, going back to those larger anxieties over media violence that the crime panic had, and talking about things like movies like The Program and TV shows like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, those extend to video games. But that wasn't the only concern, although those were big ones. The things that were unique to video games with this, within this larger anxiety over violence in society, were, for example, that games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap kind of represented a transition to a more older audience for video games. Now, at this point, now children and young boys were not always the default audience for video games, and I might do that in a later episode. It's definitely being covered by scholars better than I can. For example, Michael Newman in his book Atari Age does a great job of covering the evolution of the identity of video game users from the 70s into the 80s into the 1990s. But suffice to say that when Nintendo comes in and gains its stranglehold over the media in the aftermath of the crash in the late 80s into the 90s, they're focusing on a youth-oriented market, young children, say like the 8 to 12 kind of crowd. And so it's often common that games are being targeted towards that kind of audience. And then you have these games that are targeting an older audience, teenagers, and then going even for that, adults. And some of the much of the marketing of FMV games was that we could have video games for a more mature, older audience. And that creates some anxieties when you have games that are catered more to an older audience. In fact, Digital Pictures' stance on Night Trap is that it wasn't for kids. And there's a very small warning on the side of it that just said this might not be suitable for younger audiences. So there's this tension when video games are considered in the public consciousness to be quote-unquote kid stuff. What does it mean when you have these mature themes in them? So, for example, this is from a January 6, 1993 article from the Wall Street Journal, which covered the Sega CD, Digital Pictures, and FMV games in particular. It said, quote, "The new generation of CD video games could be flirting with trouble. Many of the new games strain the image of video games as G-rated family entertainment. Some software developers, hoping to avoid outside interference, want to rate video games the way feature films are rated to appease concerned parents and watchdog groups." And a quote from Olaf Olafsson, president of Sony's electronic publishing division, and Sony worked a little bit on the Sega CD, said, quote, "Video games started as a low-end toy business, but with CD technology, the games are more sophisticated and the demographics of players are getting older. The games will bridge the gap between teenagers and adults." And that then creates a tension. What does it mean for children playing them if they're not games for adults? And what's the access to them like? With that, there's also another point is that it's not just that there are physical violence, like I said, there were violent games before games like Mortal Kombat. There was Chiller, and there's Splatterhouse, and there's games like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But the fact that games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap have digitized representations of real people, that we're now seeing a bridge into an abstract characters into people who look like real human beings. And what does that mean if we're now seeing depictions of, say, physical and even sexual violence directed against realistic interpretations of live people? Are the games of the future going to be akin to snuff films? And not just snuff films you can participate in and actually commit those acts. So, for example, this is from a May 28th, 1993 issue of the article in the Chicago Tribune, which said, quote, with new computer technologies emerging, particularly the advent of CD-ROM drives that will soon bring television quality movies to the game boxes, Nintendo and Sega already are selling to youngsters 15 years and older. The prospects for even more graphic mayhem become greater still. And are these going to create blurred distinctions between fantasy and reality? So, for example, one senator, Byron Dorgan, said in an op-ed in December 28, 1993, he said, these are not Roadrunner-type cartoon figures in games like Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. They appear as real people, produced in virtual reality. For kids, it's just a cognitive step or two away from the real thing. And so an anxiety over the realism of these types of games. And then the final thing is depictions of sexuality. Sexuality has an interesting relationship to games. Particularly, we have games targeted from, say, younger audiences or adolescent. Much has been said about the way video games have been catered for a long time towards a specific market of heterosexual adolescent and teenage boys. And what does that mean for sexuality? What does it mean for representations of women? What does it mean for men? But particularly how female characters are depicted. How much can we have skimpy women in skimpy nightgowns and pajamas on screen? And what does that mean? When, again, going back to the idea of this is a youth-oriented audience, what does that mean? So, for example, I mentioned a little while ago Carol Rivers with that video game Did a Crime Tomorrow. She had the question of could sexual depictions in games, especially to a market directed at heterosexual boys, create unhealthy associations with women and sex? Going so far as to say, quote, what if young boys find out what's fun is not saving the girls in Night Trap, but seeing them murdered? What is more likely to become a permanent part of the sexuality of a young boy? The drama of being Sir Galahad, or the darker thrill of seeing death, violence, and sex all wrapped in a full-color electronic package? If the rancid garbage of sexual violence is what we present to our children as entertainment, one day we will discover we are not going to like the stench we have created. I can't comment on whether it would ever go to the extent that Rivers has suggested, although there have been many discussions about what does the representation of female characters in games mean for how we think about women in media. That's a big issue. Whether it goes this far, I'm not sure. But these are anxieties that are happening with this. And again, if you think about these depictions in newspaper articles where say, these scantily clad, nearly naked women being hung up on meat hooks and drained into wine bottles, and what does that say then about this game? And all of these concerns about Mortal Kombat and fatality finishers and blood on the screen and Night Trap and the depictions of live people, particularly women in these scenes, all of this leads down to what we've been talking about, what we've been building up to over the course of these last 5 going on into 6 episodes. We're going to Congress next and talking about how the anxieties over video games, over violence, the promises and concerns over virtuality and FMV games all lead eventually to this head that will lead us to finally answer the question of how video games got age ratings in the United States. So let's recap. In the eyes of moral entrepreneurs, again, those people who advocate for moral panics, who are members of the media lawmakers and advocacy groups, media watchdogs, all them, Both Mortal Kombat and Night Trap conjured fears of the impact of violent media on society, especially on children. But the backlash against Night Trap was disproportionate to the game's impact in terms of exposure, quality, or level of violence. And that anxieties over video games in 1993 focused on depictions of violence, realistic depictions of live people, and adult-oriented games in a market assumed to be for children. And we'll go even further about larger concerns over the role of violence in society, real or perceived. So that's a lot to talk about. I actually had tons and tons of notes. This was really fun to research this one. It was really interesting. I got to do some new stuff that I didn't cover in as much detail as I should have in my dissertation. But let's leave it. We'll leave it there. I'll give it a moment just to check out the chat to see if anyone has any questions, and then we'll wrap up. All right, well, I'm going to put my contact information if you end up having any questions or comments, or you can leave in the comments below. I will be checking them. But thank you again for watching. Hello to those who are watching it after I'm recording this, and thank you to those who have toughed it out this far who are watching it live. We went a little longer than we've done for the last couple of episodes. I appreciate you bearing with me on that. But if you like what we're doing, here's what next week's topic is going to be. We're almost to the finish line on this. Because next week, Friday, May the 22nd, we will get to part 7 of 8, and we'll be covering the congressional hearings over video game violence. Video games go to Congress with a special focus on the one that happened on December the 9th, 1993. I hope you'll tune in next week. If you want to learn about the whole series, you can check out the link that's here. I also have it in the description below to a page about the series. You can follow me on Twitter for updates on the series and more information about the stuff I talk about, especially regarding video games and video game studies. And feel free to like and subscribe. I enjoy doing this. I hope that the time that you took to watch this was time that you weren't worrying about, everything else that's going on outside the walls of this screen here. So I hope that helped, and I hope that expanded your mind a little bit. And thank you again. Thank you to everybody watching, and I hope you'll tune in next week. Take care. Stay safe, everyone.